In a new book, Dancing on Bones, veteran journalist and author Katie Stallard examines ways in which leaders of China, Russia, and North Korea manipulate the past to secure their grips on power. Joining me today is author of the book, Katie. Thank you so much for being here with me.
Thank you for having me. It's great to join you.
Right, so Katie, I wanted to start with the title of the book, Dancing on Bones. I wonder if you can tell me a little more about the meaning of the title.
Yeah, so this is a quote actually from a Russian activist who, together with a few friends in 2013, decided that he would set up his own memorial movement. He was unhappy with the way that the memory of the war, what is known in the West as World War II or the Second World War, was known in Russia as the Great Patriotic War. He felt that the state commemorations had become too bombastic, too militaristic, that the real people and the real lives that the war had taken had been lost. So he and his friends started this procession that they called the Immortal Regiment, where they would just march quietly holding photos of their relatives and of ancestors who had died in the war. The movement became incredibly popular. Suddenly tens of thousands of people across Russia wanted to take part. So the authorities inevitably co-opted it, worked it into their own rival movement. And it's now this, enormous annual event that Vladimir Putin takes part in. He marches at the front with a photo of his own father in these processions every year. So this was this man's view of what had happened was that the authorities were now dancing on bones, was his word. He felt that they were really exploiting the memory of this war for their own political purposes.
When I read the book, it really draws from your firsthand reporting on the ground in North Korea, Russia, and China. And I keep returning to the quote from 1984, who controls the past controls the future, which is sort of the central tenet of the book. In a few sentences, why do dictators in these countries relentlessly erase, distort, and co-opt the country's history?
Well, the short answer is that because it works. It is a terribly effective way to appeal to your population to be able to draw on these national myths and to be able to use this quite distorted often memory of the past for your contemporary political purposes. And I should say, I write this in the book too, that the impulse to do this isn't unique to autocrats. We're talking here in the United States, and I think we can all think of people who've tried to use the American history for their own purposes. So the impulse to do it isn't unique to autocrats. But I think what's particularly interesting in these three cases is really what happens once you strip out all alternative versions of history, and when you really then only have the official version of history, and it becomes very dangerous to try to push back against that and to try to tell a different story about the past.
In the book, you write about the Chinese Communist Party's renewed campaign against the so-called historical nihilism. Putin's war messaging is eerily similar, this idea that our country has made the greatest sacrifice to save the world from the Nazis, and we deserve respect from the West. How concerned should we be that Xi Jinping or some other future Chinese leader will weaponize China's history to justify war in the future, perhaps against Taiwan?
Yeah, I think we should be very concerned, and we should understand that in such an event, this is how that would be explained to the domestic population. As Putin is doing now, the case that the leader would make is that they are doing this to defend China's security, and that they're doing that to reclaim land that the Chinese Communist Party insists is rightfully Chinese and was taken from China as part of the century of humiliation that the Chinese Communist Party focuses on very heavily in its current messaging. But I think this is not just a factor in a potential and probably quite unlikely physical war. I think it's important to understand that this is also how all sorts of contemporary issues are being framed, like the territorial disputes, and even just the need for the Communist Party to be in power at all, the intensifying rivalry with the United States. This is being framed by the Communist Party for its domestic audience through the prism of this past history and the past suffering that the country has experienced.
I want to turn to this document, the third historical resolution, which was passed last year. You also write about this document in a book. So tell us, what's the significance of that document? Why is Xi Jinping so fixated on sort of presenting the correct version of the history? And how does Xi Jinping position himself in that version of history?
I think we've really seen since Xi Jinping came to power this real top-level focus on history. He was really explicit from the early weeks of being in power how important it was to take a firm grip on the past and the danger that what he calls historical nihilism could pose. And I think this historical resolution we really see as the end result of that campaign, this idea that you need to take a firm hold of the past and you need to make sure that the official narrative is agreed upon. So I think what you see in the historical resolution is the Communist Party's version of history. And it's interesting and fascinating to read because it helps you to understand, this is the version of history that young people are going to grow up learning there. This is the version of history that officials need to refer to. And when you read that version of history, the moral of that story is always that, and therefore the Communist Party needs to be in power. I mean, Xi Jinping talks explicitly in his speech around the 100th anniversary, and it's there in the text of the history resolution, that the Chinese Communist Party is the foundation and the lifeblood on which China's future depends. So the argument of that document and the endpoint of the Chinese Communist Party's version of history is that when you look back at the past, you understand why the Communist Party needs to be in power, and therefore why anyone who disagrees with that mustn't be a patriot. It's unpatriotic, or it's something that a traitor would do, is to suggest the opposite. So that history is really being used to serve the party's purposes now and to make the case as to why they believe they must be in power.
Right. And in the book, you also talk about how this operation of manipulating history is sort of like a disinformation war on the domestic audience. Do we have evidence of the effect of such historical narrative on the domestic audience? I mean, in the Russian case, we see that Russians seem to, or at least the majority of Russians seem to have accepted Putin's justification for war. Some may even be rallying support behind Putin. If anything, the Chinese media environment is more restrictive than Russia's. And we don't have transparent, public polling data telling us the truth. But to what extent has the official narrative convinced the public based on your, firsthand on the ground reporting and your source?
I mean, it's very difficult to measure through polling in China for the reasons that you outline. Certainly, I can tell you from some of the reporting I did for the book, for instance, talking to high school students about what they were learning about the Second World War's history and how they interpreted that. They all told me that they felt very strongly, having heard about, having read about, having studied how China had suffered in the past, they all made this link to, therefore, we must be strong now. It's really important that China is never weak again, and therefore it can never be made to suffer like it did in the past. But I think, beyond those firsthand and the sort of anecdotal experience, Russia, where we can measure this to a greater extent, I will be honest that I was surprised at how well this narrative has held up there. I did wonder whether once Russian casualties started to be sustained in really large numbers, once the economy started to suffer, I wondered how much support there would be for this historical narrative and for the case that Putin makes, that this is a new war like the great and noble war that they fought in the Great Patriotic War. But the evidence so far there suggests that it is holding up, that it is being persuasive to citizens who are hearing the Kremlin's line, and that is resulting in support for the war.
Right, and although the targeted audience of that narrative is domestic, but the effect, the externality definitely goes beyond the border of the country. To U.S. policymakers or to people in the West, what can we do in order to stop that narrative from becoming, sort of a realized kind of danger to the world?
I mean, I think one of the things, and part of why I embarked on the book, was just to try and flesh out a more nuanced picture of what is the story that the leaders of these countries tell their people. What is the case they make for the moves that they're making? So I think firstly, understanding that and not playing into those narratives. But I think secondly, doing everything that can be done in countries like this in the United States to make it possible for scholars, for historians, for ordinary citizens from these countries to come here, to study freely, to learn anything they like about their country's history, and to bring their expertise, their interviews, their firsthand experiences here. I think what is really unhelpful is some of what we see now with the rivalry between the United States and China, resulting in a difficult environment for Chinese citizens, Chinese students, Chinese scholars to come here. That's the opposite of what the United States should be doing. They should be making it as easy and as welcoming as possible for brilliant young scholars, to come here and to pursue their work here in the United States.